All right, so welcome everyone. This is the Psychophiles podcast, and we have a wonderful guest today. His name is Doron Cohen, and he's the program director for the psychology pod. Sorry, not the psychology podcast, the psychology program. And we're also joined by Marshall Lester and Olivia Duchiquette, who are my wonderful colleagues at the program. So, if I could just get a little bit of an intro into who you are, Dr. Duran, and what you do to make our program what it is today.
That's such a lovely introduction. Thank you. I'll come again. Okay, so I am the program director, as you said, for the psychology program, and I took over from the previous program director just about a year and a half ago, a little bit less maybe. And what I really, really want for our students is that they have a world-class education in psychology that's in that sense commensurate with the University of Manchester's standing, that it's enjoyable, stimulating, and over that year and a half, I've been working, and a lot of this is behind the scenes, so students don't actually know. But I've been working with particularly Dr. Annie Pye, who is our Deputy Programme Director, to do a full-scale programme review. So, this might be unpopular to say, but I think we are over-assessing students at the moment on the programme. And I'm aware that you guys are all in year 2.
Yeah.
And I think that's the year where there's more over-assessment than in probably any other year. And so we're working, and it's not going to necessarily benefit you guys, though your feedback is going to benefit previous students, as previous students have benefited the degree that you're currently doing. And we are also making some tweaks to third year, which is also around assessment change and reduction, which will benefit you. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that behind the scenes, we are, and I was very keen when I came in to the role to do this program review, because I think it's been quite a number of years since the last one. And I felt that I had a reasonably good sense of what students wanted, but I couldn't make it happen very quickly.
Yeah.
Because there's lots and lots of processes within the university. Of course, the British Psychological Society need to be involved. They need to see what the new program structure will look like and approve it. The faculty do, and lots of consultation. So sometimes when, and Hugo, you were a rep last year.
So was Olivia.
So was Olivia. You would say things, and I would take them on board, but I couldn't always make things happen in the time scale that perhaps you wanted, or that I would have wanted for you. And that's the challenge really of being a program director, I think. So to answer your question.
No, that completely makes sense. I mean, it sounds like a very difficult role because you have to deal with so much bureaucracy. So you said British Psychological Society. I suppose our existing staff, so people who already are used to certain ways of doing things, and you need to, I suppose, teach them to try another method.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that, we're all, and I am as well, very attuned to my own assessment. And I think that staff in general agree that we should probably start to reduce assessment, because, well, I think there's lots of reasons why we want to do that. One of them is that we don't want to increase the burden on you guys.
Yeah.
And I think that over time on a program, what happens is staff leave and new staff come in, and rather than removing an assessment, they add an assessment. So you get sort of assessment creep where the assessment load goes up, and every few years you need to kind of do an assessment cull and go back to basics.
Yeah.
And that hadn't happened for a while with the pandemic and other things. And we also are doing it because our course has changed. There's a lot more students on our course.
Yeah.
And also there's a lot more diversity of students. And one of the things that we've been doing at third year, which is going to benefit you, I think, is that we've, had historically nearly every third year unit would comprise of 2 48-hour exam essays, so 2 essays in a 48-hour exam period,
Yeah. Yeah.
and a coursework essay. And so
Yes.
all you were really being assessed on is how good you are at essay writing. And essays are great, right? They're really great. I love them because they do show me how good you are at writing essays, synthesizing data, building an argument, and critically evaluating. But actually, we now have a very significant number of students who are non-native English speakers on the program. We have ChatGPT, which is obviously something that staff worry about in terms of the quality of the work that some students will be putting in, and where do you draw the line and what's theirs and what isn't.
Yeah.
And there's lots of skills you'll never be asked in the world outside to write an essay.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you will be asked to write a report, to write a proposal, to think of an intervention, to write a research paper, to maybe just develop a podcast. I mean, you could have an assessment which is basically a podcast, and some universities do that. So it might be like go and interview 2 people and debate some particular aspect of
Yeah.
psychology.
We're about to get to the debate part. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, no,
Oh,
no,
yeah.
no.
Yeah.
Don't like your changes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting. My next question was going to be, do you think more diversity in assessment might be a kind of solution to the problem?
So that's definitely the direction of travel. More diversity so that people can showcase their talents above and beyond just the essay. So we are trying to think about infographics and podcasts and video essays, which we have already at third year a little bit. And a few different kind of techniques that gives people a bit more flexibility to showcase their knowledge and their expertise. So that's kind of one solution.
Yeah.
And then maybe even thinking about MCQs even at third year, because at the moment we don't have MCQs at third year. And I think that actually another problem that we have, I think, is that currently in third year, it is possible for some students, and students are always strategic, right? And you should be strategic with your education. And so students can decide, oh, I've covered this number of lectures, which I know there'll definitely be an essay on. So I'm not going to go now to the next 5 lectures. And so we've got staff who come to me and say, well, Doron, we've got, my attendance is really bad. And it's because of this kind of assessment mechanism.
Yeah.
So if we have some MCQs, nonetheless, at final year, or short answer questions or something that requires not just some depth, which is what essays are great at, but also some breadth,
Yeah.
then I think that's a good thing for your education.
That makes sense. One thing that I was wondering about, because you're telling me about the ways that you think the program could be improved, I'm aware that you've been on the psychology program yourself. And I'm wondering how that has shaped your understanding of how you can actually help students right now. Tell me a little bit more about your past experiences and how they led up to this position.
Yeah, sure. So I was an undergraduate on this very program, and I came from school or sixth form college really in 2001. Which feels like a long time ago now. I'm very, very old. And and I did my 3-year degree here. And in 2001, I mean, higher education was very different. The course was quite a bit smaller, though still hundreds of students. And we didn't have. I mean, it was the staff in those days. Not all of them. A lot of them were really disinterested in teaching.
Oh, wow.
And there wasn't the same focus from the university, I don't think, on student experience. In those days, coming to university was quite a bit cheaper. It was only something like £3,500 per year. And students' voice and students' kind of experience was just not something that was really thought of very highly.
Yeah.
And things were much harder, you had to go to the library and photocopy stuff, and there was no podcast. So it was a very different experience. But I did leave feeling that it could have been better, warmer. I didn't really feel like my academic advisor really cared about me.
Mm.
I didn't feel the university really cared about the students that much.
Mm.
And I think there's been a massive shift, really, not always for the better, but mostly for the better, since the advent of sort of £9,000 kind of fees. I think universities have had to say, well, hang on a minute, we're charging £9,000 and much more to our international students. What are we giving back in return?
Yeah.
And I think that's led to a lot of work in the sector around thinking about student voice and well-being and all the things that we should be championing.
Yeah.
So that's kind of
That's actually
Yeah.
really fascinating because coming from the public school system in the US, where I was, it was a really good system, I have to say. Good teachers, very engaged in what they're doing. But there's no such thing as like a student well-being office, no such thing as a careers center. There's just so much more stuff here and so many more opportunities
Yeah.
to interact with, I suppose, the broader Manchester community through the university. It almost seems like they're trying to help us. Well, hopefully, it seems like they're trying to help us adapt to the real world and have a lot of resources.
I mean, even the career service was not really what it is today. I mean, I know that there'll be students listening to this who will be thinking, well, my academic advisor still doesn't care about me, and the career service isn't doing, I still don't know what I'm going to do for a career outside. But I promise you that you guys have it really, really good compared to former generations of students.
Sure.
That's not to say that we can't improve
Of course.
and make things, better.
Gotcha. Yeah. So one thing that I was wondering about when you were saying that you're attempting to make things better, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your experiences when you were in university in those years, because I think it'd be nice for the audience to have a sense of what it is that you were missing that you're now trying to provide for the students.
So I was probably a very anxious student in many ways, quite determined to do well, probably the sort of student that I see now that I think, oh my God, no, grow up. But the kind of student who is extremely grade focused, which isn't really great because you want to enjoy the university and you want to be able to step outside and think about those big issues and not think just about your grades.
Yeah.
I definitely felt overwhelmed in the first year. I didn't really know what I was doing, and I definitely had some doubts about whether I should have chosen psychology or some other option. There were other options at the time. I was very into languages, still am. So that was kind of difficult. And I immediately found some areas, really interesting, like social psychology. But other areas, like, stats, not very interesting and also very difficult. And it kind of changed for me a bit in year 2, where I started to really find my feet, get my head around what I wanted to do. Not what I wanted to do, but certainly like the areas of research that I was interested in.
Yeah.
And then started to do quite a lot of work just independently, really, reading around kind of things that I'd heard in lectures that I thought were really interesting.
Yeah.
And also really worked on my stats and research methods, which was something that I'd always found a bit more difficult, and got that, to a high level. And then final year was great because in final year, you got to work with, and you do get to work with a supervisor on a piece of research, basically. And that was, I was always scared of it. I always thought, oh my God, like, what will they, what am I going to have to do? Will I be left alone? Will I be unsupervised? And it was just really good. I got into this area, which I then did my PhD in, which is really about the hand movements that we all make when we talk. So we don't really think about it very much, but if you look at any two people having a conversation, they're nearly always making some kinds of movements of the hands and arms.
Oh, yeah.
Which in some way sketches out meaning. And that's quite interesting because from a social psychological point of view, I ended up doing a project looking at, well, what happens when people are telling lies, when they're being deceptive, what happens to these hand movements? And there was
Oh,
a
that's
little
interesting.
bit of research already that said, well, when people lie, they generally make fewer hand movements than when they tell the truth, and their body is a bit more rigid. And what we found was that was true. We brought participant students into a room and we gave them a stimulus. It was a cartoon, basically, that they, like a comic, a static cartoon. And they described that in two versions to another participant. In one version, they told the truth. They described the cartoon as it was. And in the other, they changed some of the details. And we did find that these kind of iconic hand movements, as they're known, decreased significantly during deception, but we also found a few instances where the gestures revealed the truth, even though people weren't talking about the truth, they were lying in their speech. So, for example, there was a frame of the comic where a character pushes a DJ, into the boot of a car, and in one condition, so people would often lie and say something like, "Oh," and then she pushes the DJ into the side of the car using the side door, but make the boot gesture nonetheless. And there's and then in life, I've started to see this. So I remember a student coming to see me, and they said something like, "Oh my god, I've read this huge book," and what you can't see, well, maybe you can see it on the video, but they made this like tiny little gesture between their thumb and forefinger.
Yeah.
Or somebody once told me, well, I was watching a couple that I knew were in trouble, and this one member of the couple said, "Yes, he kissed me on the cheek, but then gestured sort of unconsciously towards the lips." And there was a few other examples. And then if you look at sort of politicians, sometimes, I think it was a French politician was welcoming Berlusconi, the then Italian, quite large man, and they said, "Oh yes, I've had a meeting with Berlusconi," and they sort of made a gesture that was kind of outward and very much about kind of his weight. So you do see these. So that really sparked my imagination for a sort of PhD. Really, it just hooked me in, and I thought I could do that for another 3 years and really kind of understand more about these hand movements. And I did exactly that. So
a PhD.
I did a PhD.
Wow.
In iconic hand movements and interaction, and not just about deception, but about how these movements pattern in terms of time with the speech, and what comes first, and where do these gestures come from, and can you predict them, and all sorts of kind of interesting things. So that was my journey into academia proper, if you like.
Yeah, that sounds really fascinating. One thing which struck me about this is it is social psychology, right? Because we are looking at people and how the context around them, and seeing if based on that context we can predict something about their behavior or their thoughts, their inner state. And so I'm wondering why you believe social psychology was something that you'd be most interested in, because psychology is a gigantic field, and I mean you have other paths you can take as well, like even into neuroscience or computational modeling. So much stuff is going on now, and I'm sure in the past as well. Why social psychology?
I think it's probably a personality thing, and it's probably around luck as well. So I think that, it might well have been that had I have ended up with a supervisor who was into neuroscience, I might have had the exact same spark and thought, oh, actually, that's really interesting. I could go and do that for 3 years. So I think sometimes we fall into things in our lives. And this is also true for students who are thinking about internships and what to do. And I always think, just try as many things as you can. A lot of them you won't like.
Yeah.
They won't go anywhere. But something will. And if you don't try, you don't know.
Yeah.
But also, social psychology for me answers one of the questions which I think I was drawn to psychology, which is quite literally what makes people tick. How do we understand, people's motivations and the relationships and dynamics between them? I probably came with a vague sense of wanting to go into clinical psychology. But quite quickly, when I started to learn about clinical psychology, I think I realised you have to be, and maybe you don't, but I perceived that you had to be a certain type of person, quite resilient to other people's kind of emotional troubles.
Sure.
And I just think that at the age of 18, 19, 20, I knew that I would find it quite difficult to cut off from that, as I still do when I see a student in distress. I mean, there's lots of students, unfortunately, who are really struggling with an aspect of their mental health or well-being. I see them, I speak to them. It's definitely true to say that that's, to some extent, I take that home with me
Yeah.
even now. But I think to do that in a high-stakes clinical situation, for me personally, wasn't something I really wanted. And that was just a choice. So sometimes you think you want something and then you realise that actually perhaps you don't.
Yeah. No. I completely understand that. One thing you said here was that you've seen a lot of students who may have mental well-being difficulties while going through university. I think that's something that's really important to address, because it's often, from my experience, and I'm sure from the experience of many people around me, we have a sense that we should project this positive, confident persona, when in fact you may feel very lonely, isolated. Moving into university is a very transformative and stepwise shift in how you live your life and with whom. So I think it's important to address what kinds of issues people can experience as they go along through their university experience. So what were some difficulties, like probably prime difficulties, which you encounter in your work as a program director and before that as a staff member?
Yeah, so I think coming to university absolutely triggers in some people, and maybe they already had it as well, and so in that case it sort of exacerbates existing mental health problems. So it is a huge change in where you're living, who you're living with, the pressure, the stress. It's changed from kind of school or sixth form. Everything's changing. It's changing at a time where you're at the peak onset for mental ill health. So we know that if you're going to get a mental health disorder, it's probably going to be at 18, 19, 20, 21. Many people already have had experiences in their teenagehood as well, but that's the peak incidence, I think, of mental ill health. So we see everything from, normal, healthy anxiety to coming to university.
Yeah.
But it's when anxiety and depression, in particular, become an impairment where students can't really focus properly on the work that they need to do, and they are starting to, sleep in, or, sleep all day, or feel that they are in a state of, significant distress. Increasingly, we're seeing a huge number of students with ADHD. It's not clear to me why that's happening, but that seems to be the kind of health condition that's really taken off, if you like. It's strange to say taken off, isn't it? But
Yeah.
it's really kind of dominating at the moment. And so when I know that DAS, for example, have said that they can't basically so the NHS can't get diagnosis of ADHD at the rate at which people are seeking diagnosis for ADHD. And that means that students here come to university and they go to DAS and they say, I think I've got ADHD. And DAS will say, okay, have you got a diagnosis? And the student will say, well, no, because it takes so long in the system, I can't get one.
Yeah.
And now DAS will say, okay, we will give you a working diagnosis of ADHD if you, go through some basic screening with DAS.
Yeah.
And that will give you, your 1 week automatic extension on top of your extension that you can have anyway. a bit more time in exams, and potentially a study coach or mentor or some other form of support. But what's happening increasingly is that students coming in and doing that maybe in year one, they're still not diagnosed when they drop off at the end. So we've assumed that they've got ADHD, and that's fine and it's sensible to do that. But it's really a failure of the NHS at the moment that they can't keep up with the demand. And of course, it's not just ADHD, but it is anxiety, like severe anxiety, depression, eating disorders. We do see that quite frequently on the program as well. And a lot of it is hidden, like you said, like you don't really know how your colleagues and classmates and course mates are doing because not everybody talks about it. And some people still feel this very acute sense of shame, I think, or some sort of stigma. So it is really good to at least be cognizant that other people on the program are potentially struggling to be prepared to kind of help out if you can. And that just means, encouraging people to talk to their AA, go to DAS, go to wellbeing.
Academic advisor. Yeah. So to me, personally, I've had a lot of experiences of people who have experienced difficulties with mental well-being, and I'm in a lucky position where I can actually get people's feedback, and many people are willing to open up about how they're really feeling about things. I think that's one of the benefits of being a student representative, is people just kind of see you as a person to complain to, in a way, but also a way, a person you can confide in, which I think
it's a privilege in a way.
Yeah, in a way, it is a privilege. I mean, especially if you're doing a course in psychology where you are focused around people's mental well-being, and that's kind of the goal that we're trying to solve as psychologists. The problem that we're trying to solve is how can we get people from a state of disorder and confusion and just mental suffering to more approximating something like well-being, a sense of happiness. And so I remember actually a lecture with you in which you mentioned that interaction with other people, belonging, is something that's one of the most important factors involved in a person's mental well-being. And so I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on your understanding of this subject, and also possibly to extend it to the student experience and how we can use those psychological insights.
So we know that loneliness is a factor that is, highly correlates with mental ill health. And we know that some students feel lonely. And it kind of makes sense, right, that you come to university and you probably were at sixth form or college or school, and you've had years and years to get to know your classmates really well. You've probably been to many of their houses, their parties, and that kind of thing. And then you come to university and you're only going to be with these people for 3 years, but you were at school for like 7. And so it's going to take quite a lot of time and effort on everyone's part to build a relationship that seems as meaningful as the relationships that you've already had. So quite quickly, students will say things, and again, it's the privilege of being an academic advisor, but it's not unusual for students to say, I'm really lonely, I've got no friends, I don't feel like I'm sitting with people in the lecture, but don't really know them, don't think they really like me, I'm not sure that I really like them, and this is not what I thought. And it's partly because we're sold a kind of saccharine view of university where everything's absolutely marvellous. We've all seen the Netflix shows around universities where it's like some kind of paradise, and of course it's just not like that. So I think setting some kind of real world expectations are important. But nonetheless, if somebody is feeling lonely, it's difficult, because what that does is it leads you to ruminate and to think about symptomology and to think about how other people might be having a much better time of it, which they're probably not. And that gets you feeling that you're not worthwhile, or you're worthless, or people don't like you, and then maybe you don't like yourself as a result. And very quickly, you can end up in a spiral of sort of anxiety and depression. But at university, it's not just about loneliness that causes that. It's also things like the pressure of work, scholastic pressure, negotiating new relationships, maybe romantic relationships. Some things come out at university that maybe you've been buried previously. So you might be exploring aspects of your sexuality, or you might be exploring, something else that's just kind of come to light. It might be that while you're at university, you've got a grandparent who falls ill. Sit on the mitigating circumstances panels, and unfortunately, people do lose grandparents and other relatives during their degree. It might be something that seems trivial, but of course it's not. So you might be here, and your parents might be going through a divorce, and you're not there, but maybe you've got a younger sibling who's at home, and you're worried about them, or maybe the family pet that you adore is really ill and passes away, and you can't really get there because you've got an exam, or on and on and on it goes. So there's just a lot happening at this stage in your lives. You're young, and you're not really fully in control, and control's another thing that kind of predicts well-being. So if you've got any of the kind of challenges that I mentioned, then it's going to put you in an increased risk probably of needing a little bit more support.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to what you were saying about when you're at secondary school and sixth form. Especially for me, I grew up with these people my entire life.
Sure.
You're so comfortable with them. I knew everyone in my year. I wasn't really best friends with everyone in my year, but I knew them. I could really talk to anyone.
Yeah.
And then you get to your lecture hall, and there's 400 people.
Yeah.
You don't know a single one of them. You don't know anyone in your flat. You actually live with people that you've never met. You know nothing about. So I completely relate to that part. And especially for people who have really strong relationships with their families and their parents, and that's a source of stability and an anchor for them. I can't imagine what that's like to struggle through that. I was going to ask, what advice would you give, if you could give any advice, to new students or students who are still struggling during their bachelor's degree?
There's no need at all to suffer in silence. We can't make things go away. We can't fix some of the issues that I've talked about, but we can support you. We can talk to you. The university does have a wellbeing team. Every student can go and speak to a wellbeing officer. The university does have DAS, which is there to support slightly more complicated cases in different ways. So as I said, giving you a little bit more time, so that if you have a flare up, you've got a bit more time to complete an assessment. And your year tutors are brilliant. And if they need to, they can make a piece of work disappear. So if you are really going through a difficult time and you've got this assessment and it's coming and you can't do it, and it's putting you at risk of mental exhaustion, burnout, which is another problem we didn't really talk about, but just that idea that people are working a little bit too much sometimes, or they're just stressing so much that they burn themselves out.
Sure.
We can make that assessment go away. It will come back in the summer, probably as a first sit, not a resit. So, there won't be any penalty. And so the students that we can't help, and the students that often end up interrupting or withdrawing, are the students that did not come forward. I know it's hard, and I know that people will be listening to this and might not be sure if they want to come forward or not. Please do. We cannot help you if we don't know that you're struggling. And there's nothing to be ashamed of or embarrassed. I have heard everything. I've heard everything that could possibly hear. And if you've got something new, I'm so well equipped to deal with it. We've had students in the past. I've had all sorts of cases where a student was from a very religious family, and the family wanted the student to marry in a foreign country, and the student didn't want to do it, and she was very scared about what would happen.
Of course.
And there were even protocols where you take a tiny spoon, like a teaspoon, and put it on your body, and if your family tried to force you out of the country to marry somebody you don't want to marry, when you go through the metal detector, that will detect. And we as the university, we can also phone up airports and we can talk to staff and say, this student might be essentially forced out of the country. You know, that's a very extreme case. We've had students with psychosis, extreme eating disorders, all sorts. And very often, if you give people a break and you say, look, one of the options is to interrupt. Your studies are still here. You can come back and retake the year next year. They do, and they do really well. And it's just about, you know, being compassionate and pausing people's degrees and allowing them to get the support, sometimes internally, sometimes externally. Sometimes it's just time. Obviously, you know, if you lose a grandparent, and in some cases, people on the program lose parents during these 3 years, you know, it's fine in terms of the degree. It's not fine in terms of them, and obviously they need support, but we can pause the degree. There are things we can do, and I'd always encourage people to come forward and just seek help.
Yeah.
I find it really interesting that you mentioned the point of the way you described losing a pet. As I think that a lot of people, if that happens to them, would probably think that's such a minor thing, and I couldn't go to mitigating circumstances about that because it doesn't justify any sort of excuse. But you made a good point in that can still have a very significant impact on your ability to study and your mental well-being if you are very connected to that. And every case is different. I know that personally, I experienced a break-in last year during exam season, the first semester exam season, and I lost my laptop in the process, so that obviously was a bit of a hindrance to my studies. But I also had a period immediately following that where it wasn't imposter syndrome exactly, but I was kind of thinking like, well, it could be so much worse. I could have lost a family member. And then when I was going through the mitigating circumstances form, which my flatmates actually had to encourage me to do because I was like, it's not that big of a deal. There wasn't a specific option for like personal crime or something like that would really fit my case. And so at that point, I kind of took a step back and I was like, they don't even have an option for me. I couldn't possibly like seek help. But I was very fortunate to have very good flatmates and an academic advisor that I did feel close with that encouraged me and really pushed me to like, you should speak to someone about this. This absolutely justifies help. So I think that providing the perspective of, in very extreme cases like the religious one that you just mentioned, and also ones that some people might kind of, you know, wave their hand at but are still impactful, it's important to still voice that because it couldn't hurt ever. And there are systems in place that even if they don't seem at first like they're exactly for a person's specific situation, they can still be very helpful in being able to give them the resources and the patience that they need in order to be able to go on and continue with their studies.
That's exactly right. Can I just come back on that? Because that's exactly right. And, you know, we make the decisions, like there's this group of staff who sit on a panel called the Mitigating Circumstances Panel, and they make the decision about whether to accept something. Nothing is too small. Nothing is ever laughed at. It's all done anonymously. So we don't know who we're judging, if you like. We get a brief description of a case, and that's how it works. And you can challenge it too. And we've certainly had situations where I know we ask for evidence. And look, we ask for evidence because there's also a very small number of students who will abuse the system.
Sure.
And we want to police it as best we can so that people don't just claim MITCERCs who were out partying and just have, you know, not managed their time well. But we do recognise that there are times where you just can't provide evidence, and we generally will just say, okay, fine, we'll do something to help you. So if you've lost a pet, you might not be able to provide evidence of that, and that's okay. If you've been in a long-term relationship, and we've had cases like that before, where, you know, it's suddenly broken down, you know, you're young, you're experiencing, that's a huge thing to deal with when you're young. And again, there might not be any absolute evidence that you can provide, like an illness, but again, we generally honor those kinds of cases unless we have a very specific reason to believe that, you know, the student's pulling the wool over our eyes. We will absolutely approve it. So you know, never be scared. It does depend a little bit on the particular staff who's on the panel on that particular day. Some staff are a little bit more hawkish in wanting evidence, and other staff are not. But I'd always say, go for it. And you know, and the other thing you said is that you had to be encouraged, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's so many students as well who are suffering in silence, who think, oh no, I don't want to make a fuss, I don't want to be seen to be difficult, I don't want to, whatever it is, or they're embarrassed because of the nature of the mitzergs. And again, we don't know who you are, we don't see it, your name is removed at the point of the decision making. So you know yeah, you're not cheating, and the reason you're not cheating, which is something else that students often say, is because we are making the decision and we're doing it based on what you're saying and ideally based on evidence. But if that's not possible, even things like parental divorce or arguing, before it gets to an actual divorce, we realise that you can't really get evidence for that. And particularly if you're an overseas student, it might be even more difficult. So we hear you.
Yeah. So one thing which I thought was really interesting, and going off of what Olivia has said and what you have said, and I suppose what Marshall has said as well, we've identified a number of different difficult circumstances that can kind of boil over into a mental health difficulty that someone's going through. So from my understanding, that does fit the pattern of how mental illnesses usually appear. I mean, if you look at adverse childhood experiences, then you see that the more a person has, the more likely they are to later on experience other mental health difficulties. So it seems like, kind of like Olivia said, maybe it feels trivial that your pet has died, but that could be kind of like the breaking point.
Yeah.
All those experiences, all that maybe sense of loneliness, imposter syndrome, and other difficulties that you were going through, it can boil over through a circumstance which by itself, if you had no other difficulties and maybe you had a very supportive environment, may not seem as crushing.
I think that's right. We know that there's always a straw that breaks the camel's back.
Mhm.
So I think this has been said many times, but it's the analogy of, I don't know, a vase, and at some point you fill it with water, and it can withstand a lot, and then at some point it overflows, or it's the straw that breaks the camel's back, and there is a tipping point, and you can never know. I mean, I see it a lot where students will, and staff as well, and myself to some extent, will overstretch ourselves. So we think we've got capacity to do that extra project, to take on that extra marking in the case of staff, to volunteer to do something a bit more. And maybe you can, but maybe one time that is just too much. So there are lots of students who are like involved in lots of societies, and they're doing lots and lots of extracurricular stuff, and they're managing fine, and then suddenly they've just overstretched themselves and they reach a point of burnout, which is more serious than I think people realise. And then everything sort of unravels very quickly. So you do need to be mindful, and it's very difficult because I think when you feel well, you don't know where that point is. You don't know. So maybe you can do that extra project.
Especially if you're passionate about them, then you're like really,
Yeah.
wanting to go and do that extra mile.
Yeah. You go until 2 a.m. and then you realize after doing it for 3-4 weeks that it's just
not sustainable.
Yeah, it's not sustainable.
Yeah.
And you're not going to 9 a.m. lectures.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's something that I can completely resonate with, even personally. Burnout is probably, if there is a personal flaw, that's probably the closest thing for me to be a personal flaw.
It doesn't surprise me with you because you are so proactive and you're always trying to do more and more and more. I think that's the impression I get. I mean, I don't know you very well, but that's definitely the impression I get.
Yeah,
that's right. I think that's about right.
Yeah, I enjoy doing things.
Yeah.
And there is this sense, and this is just speaking from my own experience, that particularly when I'm gonna say this, when you're young, when I'm young, there's the sense that you don't know your boundaries. You don't know where you have to stop, and especially if you've kind of lost that that balance of family who tell you, you know what, it seems like you're a little bit overworked. Why don't you take it easy today? When you've lose that, it's like a balloon. It's like a balloon with helium just going up and up and up,
Yeah.
and it just there is no
Mm.
point at which you're stopping. So that's like the opposite of extreme of not doing anything is doing everything.
Yeah.
Or trying to do everything, because of course
We see
you
that
can't do
during
everything.
during exam season, don't we? Like some students will just stay up all day and all night, and
Yeah.
they'll
I've done it.
yeah, exactly. And that's why I'm not a big fan of the 48-hour
Yeah.
exams that we
Yeah.
currently have.
Yeah.
I think they're great for some students who need time pressure. There were some students, quite a lot of students, that say to me things like, I know I like them because it forces me to do the essay in a very kind of compact way, and that's great. But for other students, I think, where do you stop? We're only asking you to spend about 6 hours on those kinds of exams, but I know that many students are spending more.
Yeah.
And that is a problem, I
Yeah.
think. Yeah.
I mean, ambition is a great thing. Don't get me wrong. But I think that, especially for the academically ambitious, assignments are something that you kind of conquer, and you try to destroy them. Like, you try to do the best you can, and when you see a 48-hour window, you think, oh, that's 48 hours of potential work that I should be doing. And but of course that's not a healthy thing. It's not healthy to not sleep for a day and a night.
It's really not. It's
Yeah.
really not. And I think they're, in scope for the review, really, because I don't like them for those reasons. But I know that some students do, so it's finding the balance, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
Would you prefer to switch to an like essay, or sorry, exam condition essay format, or just only coursework?
I would haven't got a very clear steer on my preference here, but I would like to not have 40-hour exams, because I think they encourage 40 hours worth of work.
Sure.
So I'd be much more comfortable if the exams were 6 hours
Mhm.
and you just had to do them within 6 hours and that was it. So it was kind of starts and stops in a manageable time. Coursework is becoming more problematic with AI.
Yeah.
But then I don't necessarily think that there's an appetite to bring students back onto campus for exams, because that feels slightly kind of regressive in a way.
Antiquated. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
when you do research, you don't go to an exam room and
Right.
start writing your lab report, correct?
I don't. And so, again, it goes back to that authenticity, doesn't it? So we talked about the essays not being terribly authentic, though it's a very good way of assessing you, but you're not going to be asked to do an essay in the world out there. And you're not really going to be asked to produce something in exam conditions. There are middle grounds where you can have an open book exam, and that's, a possibility. I think MCQs will always have to be in person, because obviously you could just potentially cheat if you were doing this at home. And I think there's a role for AI in education. It's obviously not going to go anywhere. It's going to get better and better, and you need to learn how to use it.
Yeah.
But I think you need to learn how to use it responsively.
Yeah.
What's the word? Not responsibly.
Responsibly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. That's actually really interesting. Currently, I'm working on something I call, for now, the AI test creator, and its intention is to create MCQs which serve as a foundation for then discussing the content further. So let's say you input a lecture PDF, and then you're assessed maybe with 10, 15 questions on different concepts covered throughout. Following that, you have the chance to actually discuss it. It's as though you were talking with an actual teacher. So just to give an example of where personally I think the technology could be heading, I think that's a real opportunity. And it seems like right now, just speaking from personal experience, there's so much going on in that field of AI. And I'm not sure whether you're particularly interested in that area, so tell me if I'm going on a bit of a tangent, but myself, I absolutely adore it. I think that there's so much potential, especially in education, for it to be integrated into our curriculums such that we can benefit, everyone can benefit. because if you look at what AI is, at least at this point, it is a little bit like ever accessible teacher.
Mhm.
So when I asked ChatGPT, could you find me 3 papers which demonstrate this with additional examples, it's like drawing upon a source of knowledge, which teachers often are, a source of knowledge, and trying to deepen your own understanding in doing so. So I think that, like, I have to say, I use AI extensively. I don't think there's a lecture which I haven't used AI for this year. Um, and I think that there's great opportunity for us to make it more and more accessible, to make more accessible education for people.
Have you noticed any changes in your grade since using AI, or is it too early?
Too early.
Okay.
Too early, because that's I've started this year basically. So I haven't gotten
Much work back yet.
essay responses yet, and I haven't gotten MCQs because we haven't done MCQs yet. So
I would say that I am really interested in AI, and I, as a lecturer, think it's great. As a program director, I think it's terrible. So I've got this kind of split personality really when it comes to thinking about AI. I think the sector doesn't know really which way to go in terms of how to manage this in an educational capacity. I agree that it offers enormous opportunity. That idea of having, a teacher, not just a teacher, but a teacher with presumably more knowledge than any teacher could possibly have at your beck and call 24/7 is outstanding. As a language learner, I am chatting to ChatGPT voice, advanced voice mode,
yeah,
in all sorts of languages every day as part of my kind of regime to maintain the languages that I speak. I have just written a paper with a colleague actually about AI and language learning. I think that if you give it an essay title and you watch it write that work back, it's very beige. It's not very good. The work it produces, if you just give it the title
oh yeah,
and a few basic prompts, is pretty
substandard.
substandard.
Yeah.
Though probably good enough for, a basic pass. And I should actually just warn you that although I can see why you would want to upload lecture slides and stuff to ChatGPT and create more MCQs, the official university policy, I think, is that you can't do that because the
Yes.
university owns the materials, and so you don't have the right technically to upload them. Of course, it's impossible to police that,
No,
but
of
that
course, yeah.
is the line, I think.
Yeah.
And I think that, I think that in terms of anything, I mean, I was talking to it the other day, and I wanted it to explain some relatively complicated thing in statistics, and I wanted it to do it as though I was a 5-year-old, not because I needed it, because I wanted to see how it did it. It was remarkable. It was accurate as far as I could tell. It was really intuitive, and I'm interested in. I mean, I'm guessing that students are using it all the time anyway.
Probably.
So I have no doubt that it's widely adopted amongst students. Yeah, the challenge that I have is that we need to, at some level as well, authenticate your ability, and I'm
Sure.
not sure where you draw the line. And also, just to say, and I'm sure that this is not true of your work, Hugo, but you can't use any of the outputs and copy those into a piece of work, because that would be cheating unless you somehow reference that you've used AI and are very explicit in how you do it. So
Yeah.
that's the kind of just the broader context.
Absolutely. I mean, just to give you a little update on all that you said in the context that I've been doing it, I've actually had a conversation with Amber Rugnrock, and Rachel Ashworth, and we've discussed all the potential implications of creating something like that. And so far, I think we found a reasonable middle ground where it would be possible for me to do that, assuming that it stays private and it doesn't get uploaded for training. So essentially, the information would stay private. But that's just a little aside. Coming back to the real point, which um, personally I'd like to focus on for a second. I think that um, what you said is really interesting to me. I'm wondering why you think that as a program director, it's a potential difficulty. Is it because you fear that students will essentially use it to replace their work instead of actually doing it themselves? As you said, it does enable, or it seems to enable people who do no work whatsoever to get a passing grade. Is that kind of the context that you're looking at this from?
Yeah, exactly that, really. You know, we can't be sure anymore. I mean, maybe we never could be sure. You know, with any piece of coursework, we can never really be sure what's going on behind the scenes. But with the and you know, people went to, you know, occasionally would go to essay mills and,
Yeah.
you know, the pay academics to write essays, and there seemed to be a black market of academics who were doing that,
Yeah,
or
I don't
PhD
know how you could.
students, or
Um,
didn't know how they had time. Um, but obviously, with the widespread advent of something as powerful as an LLM, and particularly ChatGPT, it's very difficult. It's so tempting. Like, it is must be so tempting, I think, as a student, to want to use that to replace some of the thinking and some of the hard work that you might have done previously. And you know, I suppose that no student ever again, which is a good thing in a way, right, would have to suffer through a weekend before a deadline, writing up some piece of work and not knowing if they're going to make it on time.
yeah.
And you know, that's definitely, I remember, you know, lost weekends of doing that kind of work. And I just think the temptation to go, oh, do you know what? I'll just take ChatGPT's conclusion because I'm so tired by this point. I'll tell you what, I'll upload what I've written so far and just say, write me a conclusion. I'll change a few words and I'll pop it in. So what is it then that, you know, is what grade should that student get
Mm.
if the conclusion isn't theirs? And what else isn't theirs? And how much do you start to fudge it in your own mind?
Mm.
How do you know in the end what's you and what's the AI?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry.
it's a great. This is such an enormous question that
Yeah.
we're all struggling with it.
Of course. I had, sorry, two different things going on in my brain. First of all, I know that the university uses the Turnitin software, which is already kind of geared towards plagiarism. But to my understanding, there's also, you know, as ChatGPT gets better and better, there's also AI detection softwares that are increasingly becoming, you know, more refined as well. So I'm curious if the university plans to employ those. I'd imagine that that's going to be part of kind of the plagiarism check that they're already doing. So maybe that could be of advantage. But then, of course, you have the kind of, well, if I change a few words here and there, then it's not quite recognizable.
Yeah.
Then I was also going to say, at least from my perspective as a student who's housed within both SHS and SBS, my tutorial unit is ran under the School of Biological Sciences. We had a plenary a week or two ago, and it was on an extended essay that we're submitting in second semester. And the person who was the lecturer who was running that plenary actually quite strongly suggested that we use AI softwares, ChatGPT specifically, for outline purposes. So as a tool to kind of construct the initial bit of synthesizing any sort of lab report or an essay, for example, but not in you know, copy and pasting, like write me this section of the lab report or the essay itself. So I'd be curious to hear what your perspective was on using it as a tool to kind of get that, you know, first jump forward.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think that it probably, you know, that's probably a safe way of doing it. Although you might ask the question, if I was being particularly difficult, well, why not come up with the outline yourself?
Yeah.
Why do we think that it's okay for the outline to be provided by AI, but not the actual words? I mean, it could equally be that someone came in and said, "Well, I'll tell you what, you come up with the outline and let ChatGPT do the actual writing." Why does that seem better or worse? What is it, I suppose, that we're trying to get students to achieve. I think we have to think about what is it we care about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, in our SQUARK criteria, there's a section on writing.
Mhm.
But in a world of AI, do we care anymore
Mm.
about writing? Is that actually something that, you need to be able to do?
Yeah.
Or is that actually just like, I don't know, the calculator's replaced mental arithmetic now?
Sure.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It's such a fascinating question. I never thought about it that way, because what you're leading us to is almost considering what are the implications of what we're doing. Are we making students less robust, so to speak, less capable of um, encountering and resolving challenges in their successive work as scientists, as psychotherapists,
Yeah,
psychologists,
I mean,
etc.?
I really worry about school kids with this as well,
Mm.
because, I mean, you'll be the last generation who hadn't had AI at school, probably.
Mhm.
And so you will have gone through all sorts of pain, but pain is gain, right? In some respects,
Yeah.
around learning how to write and articulate stuff and other things. And think that kids at school these days, again, who's gonna give up a weekend
Yeah.
when you could just go to ChatGPT, get a good essay,
Mm.
make a few changes, and in sort of 30 minutes, your essay on Macbeth or whatever it
Yeah.
is done and it's ready. And so, and then I haven't got the answers. I genuinely haven't got the answers, but I can tell you where staff are
Okay.
at, which might be helpful. So I would say that there are a huge range of opinions within the
Mhm.
staff. There are some staff whose opinion will be bring them back into exam halls, give them a essay to do in exam conditions, and authenticate it that way.
Mm.
And then on the other side, there'll be staff who say, let them use AI for everything, for every single aspect of writing their work. And then what you'll find is that the quality of work will go up. And so you'll need to do even better to get a first. You'll really have to use it well, and you'll really have to, you know, um, you'll really have to get the students to probe and prime and go back to some of the papers
Mm.
to get a first, so that the quality of all the work goes up.
Yeah.
But it's harder to get kind of a top grade.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
interesting.
And then there's, I think, still a very significant number of staff who have heard about ChatGPT and who sort of know what it is and have played with it for about 10 minutes, but are missing the incredible power of large language models and haven't really given it much time. We also know from lots of different sources that academics are probably using it when they send off peer-reviewed papers.
Yes. Yeah.
So there are
Yeah.
evidence that certain phrases, and there are a few phrases that pop up
Mhm.
that I see now that I never saw and it's things like,
I'd be happy to help at the top there.
oh well, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. 4OS, 4O at the bottom,
Yeah.
yeah.
or O1.
Uh-huh.
So I think like when this phrase nuanced relationship, that particular phrase I never ever saw.
Yeah. I actually remember that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In like 14 years of marking essays, I've never seen that particular phrase, and now I see it quite a lot.
Mm.
Yeah.
And there's a few other bits and pieces we're going to delve into.
Mm.
That seems, to have just come from nowhere. And also the phrase partnered with this, you might say this, in combination with this other research, but it's like this partnered with, and that seems a bit too Americanized almost. I don't know. I don't know what two
Oh
Americans in the
no!
room. So
Everyone's
I've
gonna
got
think
to
I'm
be
using AI.
even in emails that start off with I'm reaching out about, that
Mhm.
feels quite
Mhm.
ChatGPT to me now.
Mm-hmm.
Which is fine, and I use ChatGPT frequently for some emails because it's quicker, and it's in my workload. It's definitely something that I'm using, and therefore, I'd be a hypocrite to say, you can't use it.
Mm.
I think you can use it for learning, though. It is amazing.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
if you don't understand something in statistics, you can just chat with it, endlessly
Yeah.
until you do.
Like a field
Simplifying
expert.
and
Yeah.
say again.
Like a field expert, like
Like,
being able to
yeah,
have that personal
yeah,
relationship with the teacher, which
yeah.
just isn't feasible with a real person.
Yeah.
Exactly, and at a time that suits you, and
Yeah.
and without any embarrassment or anxiety
Mm.
that comes with asking a real person and thinking, are they judging me? Should I have known this? Have I missed something in the lecture?
Yeah. It's not gonna say like, why did you not learn this yet?
Yeah,
Yeah, if you've not been paying
exactly.
attention.
Yeah. Why are you not paying
Olivia,
attention?
I've explained this 6
Marshall?
times. Exactly.
Guilty.
So I think that's really the beauty of it. If you're talking about giving everybody a world-class education,
Yeah.
you've got these tutors. I do have a little pet project. I've not got it off the ground because I'm so time poor. But one of the things that staff often say, and one of the things that's been said lots of times is, well, another form of assessing students to be certain that they understand stuff is to bring them into a room and to interview them,
Yeah.
and that's
Mm.
called a viva, right? It's called a viva exam, kind of live voice exam. And it's obviously very difficult to do that on a program of our scale because
Yeah.
how on earth would you staff that?
Mm.
Except, of course, you could use AI
You could.
as the examiner. And so it might be that we say,
Yeah.
right, that I upload something to my own GPT, which is a particular little program you can make within inside
You
ChatGPT,
can, yeah.
or I come to Hugo and say, look, Hugo, code me something that's going to work. And I say, everybody at 3 o'clock, you're going to, in the afternoon, or 2 o'clock, or whatever, you're going to go onto ChatGPT and it's ready to quiz you
Mm.
on social psychology. There's no handwritten paper this year. There's no MCQs. It's just going to have a conversation with you and probe your knowledge. And it would be designed to not give you any answers.
Yeah.
And you'd have to respond relatively quickly, like a conversation,
Mhm.
which would presumably diminish the amount of sort of secret typing you
Yeah.
could be doing. So
You
it
can
might
also record it and
Record
you
it.
can block the computer so they can't go to any external sites. So there is the way to do that.
okay.
The
okay.
irony of that is phenomenal. To use ChatGPT as an examiner to avoid students using
Yeah.
ChatGPT during exams
Ooh.
is just incredible.
Yeah, that's and so what I'm thinking of doing, and I might come back to you guys, is just as a sort of feasibility study after your exams, if I ever get around to it, in semester 2, after your exams, I might come and ask you to simulate what that might be like,
Mhm.
and I want to know what it feels like to you. Does it
Yeah.
feel? One student said to me recently, "Oh my God, I'd really like that because I find it very difficult to express myself in writing.
Mm.
But if I
Yeah.
could just explain in words, then I think I'd be okay."
Mm.
So you could imagine, this AI ChatGPT saying,
Yeah.
so, Marshall, can you tell me about the matching hypothesis in relationship formation? And then you would say something, and then it might say, okay, can you just explain this bit again in a bit more depth? Because
Interesting.
I just want to make sure you know it. And then, and this is the really naughty bit, you could potentially get AI to grade students,
Yeah.
which might be fairer than a human marker because
Yeah.
human
Yeah.
markers have biases.
It is
more
statistically
consistent.
It is.
it is
There
a
is.
statistical model basically.
Right.
So it's like doing a regression analysis. It makes it perfect each time.
Interesting.
And then we would have lots and lots and lots of staff who, instead of marking these
Yes.
things, would moderate. They would
Yes.
go in, they would look at the recordings, they would make sure that everything was kind of working. I mean, that I think is possibly what the future might be looking
Yeah.
like.
Yeah.
It seems to have a really good, like it definitely offers another form of assessment that assesses something that is a real world skill that you would need in your
Yes.
career in almost anything because, regardless of
podcast,
the
right?
field that you're, sorry?
This podcast even, right?
Exactly. Like
Being a
regardless of the field
lecturer.
you go into, like you need to be able to show a level of expertise and also interpersonal skills,
Yeah.
and the ability to convey what you mean succinctly and while also giving off the impression that you know what you're talking about. That's important. You have to sell yourself in almost everything. So
Yeah.
that would be a really it offers so many benefits. Many of what you spoke about in terms of avoiding the kind of cheating of using AI. It also would decrease staff workload in terms of marking, but
Yeah.
also open up another facet for being able to assess a skill that is really important in our careers, but isn't necessarily being looked at the moment.
So I think you've said something really important, which is another thing that I'm thinking about all the time, and so is Annie, which is that we want students to leave this degree with the uniquely human skills. In a way, what we teach you in any particular lecture doesn't really matter. It matters at the time, but what really matters is the skills that you walk away with
Yeah.
after the degree. Some of those skills will be, critical thinking skills, evaluation, and very much tied to content, though the content itself doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
Some of the skills will be uniquely human, negotiation, time management, leadership, oral skills, presentations, your ability to do this. All three of you are hugely articulate, because if you weren't, you wouldn't be able to keep this podcast going. Not all students are, though, necessarily as strong in that area, and it's something that I think in the future we're going to want to do more work on, because that's going to be something that's critical for any job that you go into in the future. It's that ability,
Yeah.
and that's stuff that I think AI won't replace.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like something, because there's always the discussion in assessments about, are we assessing learning or are we assessing how good a student is at doing this assessment?
Oh, yeah.
And that seems like it's moving closer towards we're actually assessing learning, because there's not really a way to feign an understanding of a topic when you're giving when you're speaking to someone about it. We're, as human beings, we're quite capable of being able to tell when someone is kind of like being a little phony. Obviously, there's ways around it to fake it, but even what you're talking about earlier at the start of this with hand gestures, like that alone is kind of a cue into like, oh, are you really, are you putting up a facade right now? So it seems like that would be another way to really make sure that you are assessing learning and not just how capable you are of doing an assessment.
Exactly. I mean, so often, and this is way pre-Chat GPT, but students would come in because they would be unhappy with a particular grade they got, and you sit there with them with their essay and you say, what did you mean when you wrote this? And they don't know, or they're like, oh, I don't know, I can't remember, it's a long time ago since we handed it in, and I don't know. And you can see that really good writing can sometimes hide lack of understanding. But if you are moving to an assessment form that's a bit more chatty and talky and about what you actually know, it is harder to hide behind that and get a better assessment of the student where you're at.
Yeah.
And it's not there. We're not there to trip you up or to try to catch you out. And we know that in a viva exam, even with ChatGPT, you're likely to be nervous and would take all of that into consideration. But then you're likely to be nervous in an MCQ exam.
Yeah, and
or
whenever you're
any
speaking
exam.
as well,
Yeah.
so it still tests it in a real environment-based circumstance. So I think
Yeah.
it would still be more accurate than what is realistically, it is a fake environment to just write an essay, for example, because you have a lot of control over how you phrase things, and you can change the phrasing to sound better, and you can create this. This is something that's very frequent in a lot of philosophers' writing. They just make this flowery language that sounds so beautiful, but then you try to understand it and you do it over and over and over again, and you realize there's no substance to it.
Yeah.
And that's just, I think that's something, such a fascinating point to make. One thing that I'd add to your ideas, I've already been planning, following the test creation. I've been planning to make an essay grader, something that I believe could facilitate markers grading, because each marker, of course, has their own personality, and you can always phrase things differently, but there are certain patterns which exist, especially in very uniform essays, which we have as part of our assessments. And I think that, I mean, talking to someone like Megan Shepherd or Katie Moran or a few other people, Jack Hamer, etc. I know that they're very busy during essay grading, essay grading season, if you can call it that. And let's say, for example, they have 30 essays to grade, and they're mostly the same with slight variations. Some are slightly better, some are slightly worse, some focus more on the points, some focus less on the points. But they all focus on the same things. They all need to include the same details. And so I think that's a place that's ripe for automation, where you could have an assistant as a grader and they make suggestions like, this area seems quite puzzling. And then you can focus on it right away, and that could save you time as a grader. And I think that looking at, considering the implications of something like that, assuming that we could make it work, we have graduate students, graduate teaching assistants who have more time, who can then focus more on the students rather than on grading. So imagine that you could have more classes with one-on-one classes with a GTA, who now doesn't have to spend all their time, all the remaining time grading an essay. I think that could serve the goal of making a more individualized and more interactive program.
I've heard that said quite a few times. There's a lot of work being done around whether it's possible to automate grading. I'm sure it is possible. There are issues around what would students think. I think the University of Manchester is much too squeamish to be anywhere near the front of that queue. You could imagine, bad media, University of Manchester outsources essays to AI. Doesn't look great. At the moment, we absolutely don't allow anything around automated grades, though there is a trial going on in FSE, which is part of the university, and they have got a company called Grade, spelt GRAIDE,
Oh, wow.
Nice.
Wow.
Grade AI, and they are basically doing, Hugo, what it sounds like you're doing, but I imagine that they are better funded,
Sure.
and sort of huge sort of company, and they are doing a trial to see, well, how well does their AI, which I assume is built on top of some API key related to ChatGPT or something like that, how well does it grade students' work? But nonetheless, I think we're still a little way off outsourcing grades to. I mean, I did say that in terms of my Viva AI thing. I said the AI could grade it, but that would have also been very much a kind of pilot, and it wouldn't stand for any real marks because we have to be absolutely certain.
Right.
On the other hand, you're right that there's a lot of noise in human markers, that we know that. We have robust procedures in place around moderation, and markers will meet before they start marking a piece of work. They'll swap some pieces of work. They'll look very carefully. But we know that there's always going to be some idiosyncrasies in there that spill out. And it's quite difficult, I think, to absolutely standardize marking. Even AI isn't... even if you give an essay to AI on multiple occasions, it will come up with slightly different grades. So it's not entirely consistent, and that's something to do with the heat number underneath it. I think it's got some kind of temperature control, which ranges from is it +2 to -2 or
0 to 1?
0 to 1, okay. So it's something to do with that. So even if you give it the same criteria and the same essay, it will come up with different grades. And the question is, do human beings do that too? And what is the confidence interval and the range of kind of, So I'm sure it's coming. I'm sure it's coming as a feature of probably the near future. And I do take your point that you will be freeing up. I mean, if someone's marking 30 essays, there's around about 20 hours work there.
Yeah.
Really. And that's 20 hours that could be spent, meeting students and supporting students and doing other stuff. So I'm sure, and also it can be really heavy for the marker.
Exhausting, yeah.
Exhausting, yeah. I really like marking, and I'm marking a batch of essays for third year at the moment, and I enjoy it. But there's no doubt about it that it's also kind of grueling. Like you have to
Yeah.
pace yourself, and I can only ever do about 2 a day because otherwise I feel like I'm not being fair to the. So it
Interesting.
takes me. It's like something I do for an hour and a half a day or whatever it is, to mark those 2 scripts well.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, anyway, it's a fascinating area, and I think it's coming. But by all means, if you've got something that you can show us that looks good. I mean, the other problem that you might have, I assume, is that you don't have access to lots and lots of past essays
Sure.
that you might want to train it on. And I don't know if Grade have done a deal with universities to access stuff. I can imagine that there's all sorts of confidentiality
Sure.
issues in
Yeah,
there.
yeah. I mean, answering your question directly, I'm aware that the tool that I'd be building would probably not be a grader per se, as in you don't get a university standard 1, 2.1, etc. I'm thinking more of something that supports you
Yeah.
as a grader.
Yeah.
However, I understand that one thing that's would be quite useful as a person building a AI tool which fulfills that role would be past essays. So I think it's not essential. You don't need a lot actually. However, it is useful to have a few. So it's useful to have maybe certainly for each grade range, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So possibly at least 10.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
probably in the middle ranges a little bit more, so you have more of an understanding of what the average is and then what the extremes are.
Mm-hmm.
Which usually is how the distributions work anyway. It's a histogram with like a standard distribution. Yeah, so that would be a requirement if we wanted to make it more official, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And again, I wouldn't be able to sign off on that because it's way above my pay grade to release other students' previous work.
Oh, sure.
But I think you're in the right zone, because I think that is something that's probably going to come.
I honestly wonder if it would be a violation. This is a complete tangent, sorry. But if it would be a violation of like some sort of university rule if you just ask people to volunteer their work and their mark. If that's like if I came to you and I said, here's the essay that I wrote and this is the mark that I got and I'm volunteering that information, am I breaching any university contract there? I know you're not exactly the person who's like super familiar with all of those
I don't know
laws, but
yeah, I could get advice on it.
Yeah.
I could take advice on it from
Just an idea.
school level, but I think that might be a workaround. I don't know.
Yes, I was thinking of that if necessary, but of course, I deeply value any words of caution that you give, because you know when I have ideas, and I think that's something that extends to other people, so that's why I'm mentioning it. When anyone comes up with an idea, usually you've got this almost like honeymoon period where you think, oh, it's just the best thing in the world.
Yeah.
This is going to revolutionize everything.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with it. And then you have to apply a little bit of critical thinking to actively force yourself against this impulse to just confirm your existing assumptions about it's great, it's going to work.
Confirmation bias.
Exactly. It is a manifestation of confirmation bias, from my understanding. And the way to cure yourself of it is to basically ask, and genuinely to ask, what will go wrong? What could completely undermine this project? And if at those stages nothing trims it out yet, then you've got a pretty good idea, probably.
Yeah.
Of course, you can always fail to predict something which you can't predict, like maybe the economy is going to go bad for the next 10 years and no business is going to get started. But you can't anticipate things. You can only make judgments within your range of understanding. And you can increase your range of understanding by having a good decision-making process, which includes both the positives and the negatives. So what you're doing is you're essentially saving me work. So if there is a challenge that I did not anticipate. So thank you for that. And I think I mentioned that to you with another idea that I had.
I know, and I always feel so bad because of course you want to support people's ideas.
Sure.
And you're full of ideas, Hugo. You really are. But I think that, yeah, all I can do is just be a critical friend in that sense.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you provide like really important insight that we wouldn't have otherwise, or that you
Yeah.
wouldn't probably get to have otherwise, just from the perspective of someone who's not only, an academic at the university, but also especially a program director. That's such a key role in terms of like really being able to see how things work from the inside.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're an insider.
Yeah.
Man on the inside.
I do
Yeah,
agree. Try not to feel bad, because that's what a good friend would do.
Yeah.
Is like,
Yeah.
be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Honestly.
Yeah. Completely makes sense to me.
I'm aware we've been talking for a while. I don't know if either of us will have to leave soon, but I do want to ask a little bit about your research, your PhD, your experience up to this point, even if it's something simple like what's been your favorite thing you've learned or your favorite part of that experience.
Okay. Just trying to think what's the yeah. So I think I talked a little bit about my PhD already. So it was very much around kind of understanding nonverbal behavior and actually arguing that gestures are, and this is a weird thing to say, are not nonverbal, but gestures, unlike almost any other aspect of nonverbal behavior, are verbal because they work so clearly with speech that if I say I've got a dog at home but make a small gesture, I'm actually saying I've got a small dog,
Yeah.
but I'm just not saying it in my
Yeah.
speech. And so that was really fascinating to me, the way that these two modalities, speech and gesture, work sort of synchronously to encode meaning. And when you walk away and you say, and you think, how big's Doron's dog? You don't know whether I said it in the speech or not. It has the same kind of
Wow.
level in your mind. You're just left with this idea that I've got a small dog, and you don't really know how I got that. And then there's some research around children and their learning of things like algebra. And if the child, as they're explaining an algebraic kind of problem, uses hand gestures, teachers, well, we found in research that you can say how near to understanding a concept a student is. It often comes out in their gestures before they actually get the right answer. So you've got some kind of practical applications of this kind of research, and again with the stuff around deception. And then after that, I did some postdoc work for a few years, and I was really looking at things like sustainability, racism, kinds of things that I still very much teach about in social psychology, and particularly thinking about implicit attitudes, so these unconscious attitudes. And we did a really enormous study with Tesco's, and Tesco's obviously have people's club card data. So every time someone goes into the supermarket Tesco, they usually, if they're a member of the club card scheme, they swipe their card and they get some points on the purchases. And we were able to look at what people said about sustainability and correlate that with what they were actually buying in the supermarket. And we saw that people who, nearly everybody in our survey claimed to care about the environment, but loads of people were buying high carbon rather than low carbon products. But when you did an IAT on these people to measure their unconscious associations, you generally found that those who were buying the most low carbon products and who had an IAT that suggested that they implicitly do actually prefer low carbon over high carbon, well, they were the people who were buying the low carbon products. So the IAT seemed to predict how well these people were buying the low carbon products. That was quite an interesting study. And then most recently, writing papers about pedagogy. So I'm interested in student mental health. I wrote a paper in 2019 about psychology students' mental health, and particularly how psychology students with mental health problems make sense of their conditions in the light of their growing knowledge of psychology.
Oh, wow.
So, it's kind of a challenge, right? So you're on this psychology degree, and you might even be hearing things from clinical lecturers, and you might be thinking, but I've got the lived experience of that, and that person doesn't. And that can cause a bit of a conflict in some people. Also, let's imagine that you've got depression or anxiety, very common, but maybe you're told by a lecturer that research shows that gets a little bit worse as people age. how does that land with you? And I'm also working, I have done lots of work with Stacey, who's obviously the other social psychology lead at year
Yeah.
one. And we are very interested in sensitive teaching. So how do we deliver some really kind of bad news stories about, if you've got a name that's not traditionally Anglo-Saxon, and of course in the cohort there's lots of students in that situation.
Yeah.
How does that feel to them
Mhm.
when they're told that? And what's the sort of like the inadvertent consequences of that on their motivation then to go and look for a job? Are we at risk by talking about well produced studies that show unequal outcomes for one group over the other? Are we at risk of actually making those outcomes worse, which is the last thing we want to do?
Yeah, of course.
It's almost
Um,
like putting them in boxes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and if you say to someone you're not going to get the job because your name's, a Muslim sounding name or a Chinese sounding name or Polish or whatever, that I'm really worried about how that lands with students.
Yeah, of course.
And so we're doing some work around that. And actually, what students are saying to us is, the minority students are saying, actually they felt it wasn't anything they didn't know,
Yeah.
and they felt sort of validated for
That's
having
interesting.
that
So
conversation.
almost like righting those potential wrongs in
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
way. And you know what? I think we should leave this for now because we've got a lab that we have to get to.
Oh, okay.
Because
It's
I was
true.
about to ask a question, but then I thought, you know what? It's going to take probably another 15, 30 minutes to for us to really delve into this idea. So we will pick this up next time. Like, seriously, I think your research has a lot of untapped potential that we need to get into.
It's really interesting to talk about
Seriously.
in this
yeah.
setting. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Dr. Doron.
Thank you so much. That was a really stimulating conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Can I just say
you.
something really quick? One of the first psychology lectures, social psychology lectures that you gave us in first year, Hugo and I had come up to you because we were student reps,
I remember.
and you had said specifically to Hugo and I that you liked our American accents and that if you were ever going to listen to a podcast, you listen to ours. And so I thought that was a very full circle
Oh
moment.
my
Oh my
God.
Do you
goodness.
remember that?
I remember that. I remember that.
I remember something like that as well. I
Yeah.
thought
So you predicted it,
Yeah,
or maybe you put it in
wow.
our minds
I did. I manifested.
that's
it.
right.
Wow.
That's
Talk
right.
about social psychology.
for a little full circle moment. But thank you
Oh.
so much. It was really super
Thank you, it's my
insightful.
pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. Honestly, really great. Really great to see you all.
Wonderful.
All
Thank you so
right.
much.